But if we can look at these therapeutic lifestyle factors, if we can understand why it is that people get sick, and then address not only those what we call triggers, but the mediators or the things that are keeping them on that trajectory, at least the things that we have control over, and we have control over a lot of things, surprisingly, then we can really, really make a huge difference. And then the toolbox goes from half full to truly full.
Welcome to the Mind Health 360 show. I'm Kirkland Newman, and if you, your loved ones, or clients suffer from mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, insomnia, poor memory, poor attention, mood swings, exhaustion, etc., I interview the leading integrative mental health practitioners from around the world to help you understand the root causes of these symptoms, many of which may surprise you and suggest solutions to help you heal. If you like this interview, please do subscribe and forward to others who might find it helpful. If you want further information, please go to www.mindhealth360.com or find us on social media. Dr. Ken Sharlin, welcome to the Mind Health 360 show. I'm thrilled to have you here. You are a functional medicine neurologist. Well, first and foremost, you're a neurologist who then trained in functional medicine. And you've written this brilliant book called The Healthy Brain Toolbox, which is really fantastic and very, very comprehensive. And I've learned a lot from it. You've also been involved in recently promoting and sort of developing a Parkinson's summit, which maybe you can tell us a little bit about, because I think it's really important. And you have in there a lot of wonderful interviews about a functional medicine approach to Parkinson's. And so, if you can just tell us a little bit about that, because I think, that will be hugely important. And then we can get into this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Kiki. I appreciate you inviting me. I want to, if I can, sort of put things in context. And, I am a neurologist and I practice general neurology, meaning that I see people with all kinds of issues in their lives, from Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's to MS, ALS, migraine, epilepsy, and so forth. And many times people have neurological symptoms, but not necessarily a diagnosis. And, I'm very traditionally trained. I learned to be a doctor at some of our nations in the United States here, best institutions. And so I'm very proud of that knowledge base that I was given as a result of, working with doctors at Emory University and Vanderbilt, University of Virginia, and so forth. And I did that for many years. The paradigm, if you will, of neurology for so long has been that we're very skilled at making a diagnosis. But for the most part, and that has changed more recently, fortunately, the ability to actually treat our patients once that diagnosis was made has been very, very limited. And even though that is changing, we now have some modest benefit treatments in Alzheimer's disease. We've actually come a very long way with multiple sclerosis. We're putting a bit of a dent in ALS. Unfortunately, we still don't have what we call disease-modifying therapies in Parkinson's disease. But the reality is that for the most part, treatment is still really one of three interdependent modalities, meaning that they're not mutually exclusive, but still the toolbox is limited. And that is, you get a drug, you have surgery, or you have something kind of in between, some interventional procedure, or maybe some supportive modality like physical and occupational therapy. But that's pretty much it. And so I can't tell you how often I've seen patients who've seen other neurologists that the patient inadvertently sort of, and innocently, I have to add, ruffles their feathers because the doctor says, well, in so many words, I don't have a drug to give you, so therefore I can't help you. Right? That's a huge problem, So for me, now fast forward into functional medicine, to be inspired by the work of people like Dave Perlmutter, who, when he wrote Brain and was on the usual media circuit of podcasts and public television and so forth, and said, there's a lot more going on here than simply looking for the right pill to match with the disease. And when he started talking about functional medicine, and that was really new to my vocabulary. I didn't know what functional medicine was, and I looked into it. What I discovered is that all of those years, my toolbox had only been half full. So in other words, yes, the drugs are fine, the surgery is fine, they're not right for everyone, but they are valuable, right? But if we can look at these therapeutic lifestyle factors, if we can understand why it is that people get sick, and then address not only those what we call triggers, but the mediators or the things that are keeping them on that trajectory, at least the things that we have control over, and we have control over a lot of things, surprisingly, then we can really, really make a huge difference. And then the toolbox goes from half full to truly full. So that's my, approach. And people say, well, I'm familiar with Dr. Terry Walls. I love Dr. Terry Walls. I'm saying I personally do. She's wonderful. And many people are familiar with her work. And her focus has been MS and neuroimmune diseases, or perhaps Dr. Dale Bredesen, who has sort of rung the bell and let us know that, hey, these very same principles apply to Alzheimer's disease. So the Bredesen protocol, what is really done is it said, hey, if you've been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, just as Dr. Walls can help people with MS, these very same principles apply to Alzheimer's. They're not different. But there's a huge gap in recognizing that, once again, these very same principles apply to Parkinson's disease. So for us to, when I say us, my partners with Doctor Talks, all of the people that were kind enough to give their time to be interviewed, my support team, as you have that behind the scenes, for us to be able to come out and say, hey, if you've been affected by Parkinson's, and we're talking about 1 million, at least, people in the United States, then there are additional tools for you. Levodopa is valuable. I always say you can't drive your car without gas in the tank. Levodopa is simply the gas in the tank. But if you're just using levodopa, then you're not doing anything to change the trajectory of the disease. So that's where the genesis of the Parkinson Solution Summit that took place this last November came from. And we, of course, hope to put on a summit number 2 this coming November and hope even more people will participate.
Fantastic. Well, that's super helpful. And then before we dive in, I just wanted to give our listeners a little bit more background about you. Sort of your bio. There'll be more in the show notes, but you're a board certified neurologist, consultant, functional medicine practitioner, author, and speaker. You received your medical degrees from Emory University and your functional medicine certification through the Institute for Functional Medicine. You're #1 best-selling author of this book, The Healthy Brain Toolbox, Neurologists' Proven Strategies to Improve Memory Loss and Protect Your Aging Brain, and of numerous essays that have appeared in media internationally. And you're also, which is something I only just found out, a 3-time Ironman triathlon finisher, who made your story of personal transformation the launching point of your career, where you shifted gears from a conventional neurology practice to a holistic lifestyle medicine-oriented approach using the action plan presented in this book. You and your team have witnessed the reversal of illness and that are supposed to be chronic and progressive, in some cases fatal. Now, you practice general neurology and you can conduct clinical research and direct your functional medicine program called Brain Tune Up through your clinic, Sharlin Health and Neurology, which is located in Ozark, Missouri. So one of the things that I wanted to find out about, obviously, and which you've touched on, was what made you go from being a conventional neurologist to being a functional medicine one. And I think you've somewhat answered that in the sense that it sounds to me that you were dissatisfied with the lack of tools in the toolbox and the lack of really your ability to reverse and, maybe to really satisfactorily treat your patients. And you found in functional medicine a much better approach where you got better results. Is that correct?
Well, I would say now, and certainly it's an evolutionary process in the sense that it's sort of like a romance, Kiki, because, you know, when you meet that person that sort of touches you here, they become everything for you. So when I found out about functional medicine, that's sort of all I wanted to do. And I would say that my lack of foresight would have been that, you know, I was too critical of what conventional neurology had to offer. And I now firmly believe that the correct path is sort of in the middle. But in the end, the correct path is also individualized, personalized medicine, meaning that even with, say, two people who have Parkinson's disease, yes, the same diagnosis, but the approach may be different for each person because we have to put the person at the center of the story and not the disease at the center of the story.
And I think that's also because essentially you can have the same diagnosis, but because of different root causes, right? And I think that's the beauty of functional medicine is it really analyzes what are the root causes of, you know, your presentation, and then how can you fix them? So in terms of one of the things that I wanted to look at was, you know, you mentioned the statistics in your book, which are really shocking. And I know that in the UK, Alzheimer's now is the #1 cause of death. And we now know that neurological disorders worldwide are the leading cause of disability. We know that 1 million people in the US have multiple sclerosis and 2.3 million globally. Now, this was back in 2018. The numbers have probably shifted. And you say in your book also, and we know this from other research, Parkinson's is the fastest growing of the neurological disorders, with the growth rate surpassing that of Alzheimer's. And you say worldwide, the number is expected to double from 6.9 million in 2015 to 14.2 million in 2040. Now, what would you say is the cause of this dramatic increase in neurological disorders? And obviously there are several, but what do you see most often in your practice, and, you know, sort of the top 5 key reasons that these diseases are growing so much?
Well, you know, it sort of falls back onto the notion that too often we think, well, it's in my genes, you know, it's inevitable, it's going to happen. But, you know, research paper after research paper really tells us that, in fact, if we look at the human evolution over time, genetically, we haven't evolved that much, right? But yet we see these changes in the rates of rise of the disease like Parkinson's, as you mentioned. So that really begs the question, well, what is the equation? If it's not all genetics, then the equation is lifestyle, environment, and genetics, and how lifestyle and environment influences the expression of our genes. And it turns out, and of course it varies from disease to disease to an extent, but, you know, listeners and viewers might be shocked to find out that, for example, in cancers, genetics plays a surprisingly small role. You know, that's true of neurodegenerative disorders, that's true of neuroinflammatory disorders. So that means that environment and lifestyle plays a much larger role. If environment and lifestyle play a much larger role, well, to a much greater extent, that means that we as humans in our human journey have much more control than we've really been led to believe. And if we can find the right guide, if you will, because I think in many respects that's what physicians are. We're not necessarily always the one who's going to know, oh, you've been infected with that bacteria, so this antibiotic covers that bacteria. Take this for 14 days and you'll be 100% better, right? Most of the time, we need a guide in this journey through chronic disease. And if we can find that right person who has that toolbox, that by analogy that we use over and over again, then the ability to utilize those lifestyle and environmental factors to address those root causes, but ultimately not just identify causes, but move beyond that tipping point of, okay, those causes led to the disease. What are we going to do now? Because now we're on the disease trajectory. So it has to be the whole journey. And this may be a bit of a digression, but there's an because this is a show that focuses so much on the mind, one of the things that most functional medicine providers don't talk about, which I think is just brilliant work, brilliant research, is the whole idea of narrative, going back to Joseph Campbell, but Arthur Kleinman, who wrote the illness narrative, and others who've really understood that the journey of becoming ill and the journey of healing really is an individualized human narrative. And there are elements to how our brains are wired from sort of a biological anthropology perspective that will not allow that healing journey to occur until we resonate with a narrative that explains why this has happened in the first place. So what happens ultimately is that there are many individuals who will get stuck because even though the information is there as to what they can do to create resilient brain health, they can't move into that space until they have that moment of resonance with the narrative that is, why did they get sick in the first place?
So do you think that a lot of this is about sort of mindset in some ways? And I mean, you know, we talk about people who are susceptible to Lyme disease or to mold toxicity. And there's a much higher prevalence of people who are susceptible to these toxins and pathogens who have had childhood trauma, for instance. And so we know there's a link between childhood trauma and being more susceptible to toxins and pathogens. And so are you saying that in some ways it's sort of the mindset and the psychological experiences that someone has had that then predisposes them somewhat to factors that might then precipitate a physiological illness?
No, well, I have there. So there's a lot that you've said there, and I'd love to get into that. What I am saying is that, we really are sort of body, mind, and soul. And there are definitely environmental factors that play a role in why we get sick. In fact, I don't know that I directly answered an earlier question when you said, what are the major causes, if you will? And I would say probably today, metabolic syndrome would be the number one major driver of chronic disease. We have to address this issue of what we call diabetes, that, so many of the people that you talk to make a big part of their career and their message. Sugar. That's not the only thing, but it's a major player, right? Diabetes is terrible, and we know that it affects, this what we call diabetes together is probably 50% in my country, 50% of all Americans.
Yeah.
And growing, right? And I think it's terribly ironic, and again, I'm not totally against it, that we created this because I'm almost 60, and when I was a kid, I had very few friends that dealt with obesity and or being overweight. Very, very few. I'm not trying to be critical, but it's almost like a cliched expression, the fat kid, right? Because there was one that implies like I had one friend. Now most people are overweight or obese, and maybe a lot of that is really not their fault. Okay, but we've created a food supply. We've poured toxins into our environment, heavy metals, pesticides, herbicides, air pollution, PM 2.5, all kinds of things. We've shifted our ecosystem in many, many ways that in some ways make it very comfortable. So I can have a podcast with you in an atmosphere controlled home with lighting, regardless of whether it's hazy outside and there's not really very good sunlight. I'm not complaining about that, but I think with that comes certain baggage, right? So now we have all the big pharmaceutical companies coming out with peptides, semaglutide and, as Ozempic and all the other drugs, the new one coming out from Eli Lilly that's, doubled Eli Lilly's stock in just the last, 12 months. I mean, isn't it ironic that we create this problem and then we have to have a drug, but we don't really address even why did this happen in the first place? I mean, it's just, to me, I'm not against Ozempic. I know it's helped a lot of people, but you know, it's so strange that here we are all over again, right? Like the famous line from the Ronald Reagan debate where he says, "There you go again," right? I mean, we create the problem, then all we have is a drug that helps people temporarily lose weight, and then we don't really change our food supply. We don't address the environmental factors. We don't address that mindset, that mind health, if you will. That's a huge part of it.
Yeah. It's interesting because in your book, you talk about the fact that the two key factors leading to neurodegeneration are really inflammation and oxidative stress. So you sort of boiled it down to that. But this book was written in 2018 or published in 2018. And so it's interesting that you now mention this metabolic crisis, this crisis in metabolic health, because it is true that, but metabolic issues and processed foods and all the things that we talk about and we know are not good for us, is it because they drive inflammation and oxidative stress, or are there other reasons as well? I mean, how do you bring that back to what you were saying, which is absolutely correct, which is still correct, which is that inflammation and oxidative stress are the main drivers probably of this neurodegeneration? Would you say that's accurate?
It still is. It's sort of the question of how far upstream do you want to go, right? So if we talk about things like sugar and insulin resistance in type 2 diabetes, we have to, people need to understand that insulin resistance is normal. Insulin resistance is a good thing. It's actually an adaptive response of the cell to an excess amount of glucose inside that cellular environment, where it forms these advanced glycation end products that lead to DNA damage and mitochondrial damage, and ultimately that storm of oxidative stress and inflammation. So that your point earlier about mold and Lyme disease, and full transparency, I'm a bit of a maverick and kind of outspoken on this issue because I do see it very differently than many other functional medicine practitioners. I think it's important to understand that infections and other biotoxins are also drivers of inflammation and oxidative stress. So if you've been diagnosed with MS or ALS or Parkinson's, and you've had a doctor say, well, you don't really have MS, you have Lyme disease. Well, you don't really have MS, you have mold toxicity. No, you really have MS, you really have ALS, or you really have Parkinson's. Understanding how pathogens are a part of the overall puzzle in driving disease is important from a functional medicine perspective. But I think to substitute sort of one, allopathic medicine is the pill for the ill, right? You make the diagnosis, you give them the pill. If you think that it's all mold and you're just going to take the pill for the mold, that's just allopathic medicine. That's not functional medicine.
Agreed. And, so essentially, so say someone presents to you with Parkinson's or ALS, and how do you then unpack what are the key drivers? And also, and this might be a completely different question, at what point can there's a spectrum of time. At what point can you intervene? At what point does it become too late because the neurodegeneration has progressed too far? These must be things that you grapple with a lot. How much of it do you see is reversible? And, I presume there's sort of a point of no return. So those are sort of two questions that are very mixed. If you could just unpack those.
Well, there's a lot, and I believe now that what we call neurodegeneration is sort of a domino effect. And, there is a cascade of enzymes called the caspase system that's ultimately responsible for triggering the programmed cell death that ultimately is the manifestation of manifests as neurodegenerative disease. And it is clear, and if we look at some of the, early successes, if you will, with the disease-modifying therapies, that whether we're talking about intervening in MS with a drug or intervening with Alzheimer's with the currently approved drugs that are disease-modifying, that early intervention, the earlier we catch the problem, the greater the success. As an example, we'll see the approval in the United States of an Eli Lilly drug that targets amyloid, which is actually, it is a cause of Alzheimer's, but it's a downstream expression of things that are driving that inflammation and oxidative stress. Okay. But in the donanemab phase 3 trials, in my research center was pivotal in contributing to that, one of the largest enrolling sites in the world. What was found is that if you had early stage Alzheimer's disease, this anti-amyloid therapy could theoretically slow the progression of the disease by about 30%. So it wasn't even altering, it alters the trajectory, but if people are looking to regain memory and cognitive functioning, it's not happening with those drugs, but it is altering the slope of the decline. However, the same drug or biologic has been tested in people who have just what we would define as mild cognitive impairment due to underlying Alzheimer's changes. In other words, much earlier stage or an earlier stage. And the expected rate of decline in that group was slowed by about 60%. So, that's allopathic medicine, but I think the same is true of functional medicine. The earlier we jump in, the earlier we make the changes, the greater the chances to slow or halt, or certainly, or potentially reverse the process of the disease.
And it's tricky because, for instance, in Parkinson's, we know that the etiology starts, 20, 25 years before you can actually get symptoms. And then your symptoms can be sort of generic, like constipation and lack of sense of smell. How would you advise people, who are essentially, it's frustrating because you're wasting this precious time. Is there any way that you can do early detection, or that if somebody, say, has constipation or loss of smell or maybe some internal tremor, how would you approach that in terms of figuring out whether this could then develop into Parkinson's?
That's a really good question that, delves into things like ethics and, even life insurance policies and, employment and all kinds of issues that I think are probably not exactly in my area of expertise, although I certainly give my own opinion about that. I am a believer, we have, despite the fact that we have this diabetes problem, I think people generally understand, that whether they talk about food as a treatment for disease, they do understand that their food choices affect their health, right? They do understand in general that some sort of movement in their life, even if we avoid the term exercise, as opposed to being sedentary, affects their health in a very positive way. They do understand in general that the quality of their sleep is an immediate ROI, right? Like if you have a good night's sleep, you feel much better the next day. That's doing something very positive for your body. So the messages are out there. How often do the messages translate into action steps, into transformation, where the message hits home so hard that you're not going to wait for that disease to actually happen?
Yeah.
So, I don't know. We can test people for the ApoE4 gene, which influences the risk of late onset Alzheimer's. I have plenty of non-ApoE4 carriers that have Alzheimer's. We know in the Alzheimer's arena from what's called the NUN study that there were lots of, plenty of intellectually normal or high, really intellectually superior, if you will, no pun intended when I'm talking about a nun, but, in other words, very scholarly orders, within Catholicism, that died with Alzheimer's pathology in their brains, but were intellectually fine. They were normal. So we have to be very careful about distinguishing between biomarker status and the clinical expression of the disease. That being said, I always use the expression in my office: if you have a little, kitchen fire, you don't wait till the whole house burns down to call the fire department.
Yeah.
But how do we change the dialogue? Because too often what I hear from patients is, I went to see my neurologist and they said, eat eat whatever you want. Has nothing to do with your MS. Has nothing to do with your Parkinson's. Just, you know, McDonald's, whatever. Go out there. Say, well, there's a guy that did a whole movie about eating just McDonald's for a month, and remember, he nearly died. So that's not a good idea, right? We have to shift that mindset from these are things that are good for your health to these things that are good for your health are also the best and most powerful tools that we have to treat the disease.
Agreed. And then if you look at sort of neurodegenerative diseases, what would you say are the key drivers? I mean, you've mentioned food, you've mentioned movement, you've mentioned toxins. But if you were to, I mean, do we have to address all of them, or do we have to identify which ones are, maybe not working so well? I mean, you talk a lot in your book about a real sort of 360-degree approach, and you're saying there's no point in doing one thing unless you do the other thing. I mean, you have to pretty much do all of it, because otherwise, I mean, it's sort of like Del Bredesen's 38 holes in the roof. It's really important to tackle all these things. But so could you just talk about sort of the key drivers that people would need to address in order to prevent these neurodegenerative diseases?
You bet. So in the book, I sort of give folks in the first part kind of a functional medicine 101.
Yeah.
I mean, it was my understanding of functional medicine that were the words on the page, but I won't say that I made up all of those, the systems biology that I refer to in the book. That's directly out of IFM. So what are some of those different components, or understanding your mitochondria and how they create not only energy for the cell, but they're responsible for your cellular defense. And some would argue even are so pivotal that when mitochondria detect threats in the environment, they have the power to sort of shut everything down as a final self-protective response. That's what Dr. Navio, of course, talks about. We have to talk about the communication compounds in the body, the hormones, the neurotransmitters, the compounds that signal inflammation is happening. That's another piece of the puzzle. Another piece of puzzle might be your detoxification systems, including the lymphatic system that allows your brain to get rid of toxins and is only active when you sleep. And of course, the one that we probably talk about the most, which is gut health, and that includes the microbiome, but it's really also anatomy, meaning it's everything from the moment food enters your mouth and you're releasing digestive enzymes, and that those nutrients are interacting with your oral microbiome, to how it goes down the tube into your stomach and you start to break it down by way of more enzymes and acid in your stomach that we need. So I always use the expression God gave us, because not for religious reasons, but all the people that are on acid blocking drugs, why are you taking this when you're supposed to have acid in your stomach, right? So that's like saying there's the fire in the house and I'll just do this, right? Like, wait a minute. Yes, I understand you have acid reflux, but there's a reason that you have acid reflux, and suppressing the acid is not fixing the reason, right? So we need that acidity to break down proteins into peptides and become, amino acids that then in turn become neurotransmitters or structural proteins in the body, among other things. And, we have to, yes, we need this healthy gut microbiome, but we don't need it all the way up into the upper digestive tract, where then it manifests as what's called SIBO, or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and we have more digestive systems, and it becomes a vicious cycle. So we do have to understand that there are systems that govern how the body works, and that imbalances within each system drives disease, but that these systems are also interdependent, so that an imbalance in one area affects another area, right? Affects another system. And then the question is, well, that seems like a lot of things to fix, right? So we have to avoid as much as reasonably possible that allopathic approach of targeted therapy, or certainly not make that our first line of attack. Because if we target one thing, we've missed a lot of other things. So then you say, well, what am I supposed to do? Well, that's what I think, and I write in my book as well, the foundations, right? We work on that sleep, we work on that nutrition, if we work on the movement program, if we work on that mind body health, this what I call stress resilience, and possibly the most important thing, work on our relationships and our connections to others, as loneliness and disconnection may be one of the silent epidemics of 21st century medicine. We are actually treating all of those systems, all of them all at once. It is the most powerful medicine there is. So I have actually moved away from saying functional medicine a lot of times, and I say, borrowing from Terry Wall's, therapeutic lifestyle medicine, because we can do the things that target mitochondria, or we can do the things that target gut health, and there's value there. But if we're not paying attention to the big picture, we're not seeing the forest through the trees.
Yeah, and you do a really good job of talking about that in your book and looking in detail at the different factors, whether it's nutrition, sleep, exercise, stress management. And you have contributing authors who work in your clinic who do wonderful chapters on exercise, diet, and also stress resilience and sort of mindfulness and meditation. So, it's a very comprehensive, great toolbox, essentially, your book on how to really dial up your lifestyle so that you lower inflammation, lower oxidative stress, and, boost your mitochondrial function, etc. But you talk a lot also about, so in terms of these sort of 7 biological systems, you talk about assimilation, defense and repair, energy, biotransformation and elimination, transport, communication, and structural integrity. And, your lifestyle approach then is about making sure that all those sort of biological systems are in balance. And I think, that's really, really important. And so even if you do have a genetic predisposition, you can then presumably stay fairly healthy if you do pay attention to these 7 biological systems and make sure that they're in balance. And just taking a few things, assimilation is sort of the gut. You talk about Parkinson's and the direct connection between the gut and the brain by the vagus nerve. And you talk about how that connection and the vagus nerve are key players in the initiation and progression of Parkinson's. Can you explain a little bit about the mechanism and how the vagus, because you also talk about technologies that stimulate the vagus and how important that is. What is the role of the vagus and that sort of gut-brain connection in Parkinson's, to your knowledge? And obviously it's evolving, but.
So the vagus nerve is the longest. It's the longest of the cranial nerves. I don't know that it's longer than your sciatic nerve, but it's the longest of the cranial nerves. And these are nerves that more or less control functions from the neck up. So, the size of your pupil, the ability to move your eyes, the movement of your facial muscles, your ability to taste things. These are all driven by cranial nerve functions. And the vagus nerve is a little bit different because although it is connected directly to the base of the brain, it actually leaves the skull and it innervates the viscera, our body cavity area. So it innervates the lungs and the heart, and then ultimately the digestive system. And the signals that it's involved with are bidirectional, so that the brain can send signals down to the viscera, but that the viscera in turn can send signals up to the brain. And so, the vagus nerve is like the superhighway of the body, and the vagus nerve is also interestingly, what you're alluding to is connected to, in particular, the function of our parasympathetic nervous system, our rest, digest, reproduce. When we meditate and do deep breathing or even gargle or hum, that all of those activities stimulate the vagus nerve and bring us into a more calm space. But the vagus nerve is connected to the gut. All the pieces, we don't necessarily have all the pieces, or I don't know that I do, but it is recognized, among other things, that There are changes in digestive health that seem to herald Parkinson's. We know, for example, that there appears to be shifts in the gut microbiome that are different in general in people who have Parkinson's disease versus people who do not. But another piece of the puzzle is the formation of a protein. That protein is called alpha-synuclein. The protein is found in the brain in what was originally described as Lewy bodies, which are the hallmark of Parkinson's disease under the microscope. These Lewy bodies, again, are composed of this protein, alpha-synuclein, which participates in many normal functions in the brain, like the release of dopamine, right? Which is the neurotransmitter that is at least most famously affected in Parkinson's disease. So it turns out that at least in a major proportion of people who have Parkinson's, that this abnormal or abnormally behaving, if you will, alpha-synuclein forms in the digestive tract, and it appears that it can find its way to the brain effectively by climbing up the vagus nerve to the brain, infecting the brain. And there is some evidence that this alpha-synuclein protein behaves as almost like an infectious, like a virus. It's been compared to what are called prions, which cause things like mad cow disease and Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, right? And that it spreads through the brain like an infection, ultimately damaging nerve cells and leading to what we recognize as Parkinson's disease.
That's so interesting. And, I'm sure, all the science behind that must be fascinating. The other thing that I've been reading is, the correlation between the increase of Parkinson's and air pollution. I was reading an article the other day about some research that had been done, especially I think in Korea, about this correlation, very shocking correlation between a huge increase in Parkinson's with this air pollution. What is the mechanism behind, how is this air pollution damaging to maybe the neurons that then, can sort of lead to Parkinson's? What's the mechanism behind that?
I think you're referring to what's called particulate matter 2.5 or PM 2.5, and it's been recognized as a major contributor to neurodegenerative disorders, whether that disorder is Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. It's very high in cities like Mexico City, Los Angeles, and so forth. And it really hits home that we need to be thinking about our air quality if we want to create brain health. What is the driver? How does it actually poison the brain, if you will? I don't know that I have all the answers for that, but I imagine it's probably a mitochondrial toxin, among other things, that it drives those processes of oxidative stress and inflammation. A couple of the things that have been getting a lot of attention lately in the Parkinson's arena, trichloroethylene or TCE, which I saw just yet another press release from Ray Dorsey's group that said people exposed to trichloroethylene have a 500% increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease. And the problem with this compound is that it is absolutely ubiquitous, like the air that we breathe. It's used in everything from in industry to dry cleaning to household chemicals, common lubricants. I had a patient come in with Parkinson's not long ago, a week or so ago. He's retired from the steel industry where he was a manager, but he said he was a very hands-on manager, and he was on the floor of the plant all the time working with his employees, and he would come home just doused in trichloroethylene. Another one is paraquat. Has really gotten a lot of attention. These various herbicides and pesticides that are thought to be related to Parkinson's. So we definitely have a huge problem. And I have a guy who's an attorney who has Parkinson's. I said, what is doctors wear the white coat, right? So anybody who's a Netflix, fan, is Stoots, right, on Netflix. So, you're wearing your pressed shirt, your expensive suit and tie, right? Every day, your skin is your biggest organ. What are you putting up against your skin every single day of your career, year after year after year? Trichloroethylene. And in the susceptible individual, Parkinson's disease.
Yeah,
Terrible.
it's terrible. And I guess, what we all have to make huge efforts to remove all the toxic elements in our households and use cleaner household products, which are more natural and, have natural dry cleaning or just not use dry cleaning at all. I mean, it's absolutely crucial. And the other thing about Parkinson's is, there's a lot of research that shows that it affects the mitochondria. It's a sort of mitochondrial dysfunction. How can you explain a little bit more about, how the mitochondria might lead to Parkinson's or mitochondrial dysfunction, and what leads to mitochondrial dysfunction?
Well, again, I would sort of emphasize that everything affects everything, but certainly mitochondria generate energy for our cells. They're involved in our oxidative, our cellular defense system. That not all free radicals necessarily, those things that cause oxidative stress, are bad for us. So mitochondria can utilize, cells can utilize some of these free radicals to defend themselves. But ultimately as well, it appears that mitochondria are also at the center of that cell danger response that leads to sort of how cells will adapt to survive. And I always, I'm an old Star Trek fan, so I say, when the starship is under attack by the Klingons or the Romulans or whomever, they have all the defense systems, the force field and the photon torpedoes and the big lasers and all that. But what happens if everything fails? Then the crew gets into those little pods, goes away from the ship, and there's a button that gets pressed and the ship blows up, right? So the final defense, if nothing else is going to work, remember that the person affected by Parkinson's may have lost cells in their substantia nigra that produce dopamine, but they're sort of like that little guy on the other side of the bridge, as I recall, in Monty Python's Holy Grail, is getting cut up to pieces and he keeps going, not dead yet, right? I mean, I think Dale Bredesen would talk about this in the context of Alzheimer's, that maybe these diseases are sort of the 20,000-foot view, sort of the adaptive response of the body in an attempt to survive an attack. We can eliminate a system, but the organism survives for just a little longer, not forever, but a little bit longer, right?
So I guess the key is really, as you point out in these biological systems, it's defense and repair. So it's, avoiding infections or treating infections, avoiding toxins or detoxifying, and then improving your environment, your sort of biological environment with the right nutrition, the right sleep, the right movement, the right stress management. And I guess it's that combination of a breakdown in our lifestyle habits, which weaken our terrain, with the assault that we have from, whether it's toxins or processed foods or, stress or EMFs or, our crazy modern worlds with their sort of overload of dopamine. It's that combination, I guess, that creates the perfect storm, of disease, or that creates resilient health. Would you say that's accurate?
It is, and ultimately we're all going to live our lives and die. That's the journey, right? But it's what we make of our lives along the way that has the biggest difference. And again, I wouldn't go out there, and I sort of want to challenge anyone who says they're absolutely curing these big bad diseases right now. If we're talking about diseases of the brain like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and ALS and so forth, multiple sclerosis, I sometimes have to remind people that are very enamored, as they should be, with Dr. Terry Walls, that she still has MS, But what did she do is she changed the trajectory of her disease. And what Dale Bredesen's work can do and what my work can do is help people to get back into the driver's seat and say, I don't have to, I'm going to have to accept the fact that I have this condition, but this condition doesn't always have me, and I have choices. And when I make those choices, it alters the natural path that this disease would otherwise take. Things are just not, the only inevitability is that we're going to die. But until we do, we can live our lives the very best that we can live them. And when we do that, it really makes a difference.
I think that's very wise. And, you know, one of the things you have in your book is, you know, diseases on one side and conditions on the other, or maybe that was, I'm maybe confusing it, but I remember a slide where, you know, these are the conditions and these are the diseases, and the two, you know, you can have symptoms of a disease or the beginnings of a disease, but without having that disease. And I think the whole point of functional and lifestyle medicine is to really try and avoid those conditions turning into these diseases, which I guess is what you do in your practice. And would you say that you, with your approach, are you heartened by the level of success that you have, or do you find it discouraging?
Well, I would say generally I'm heartened by it. And, you know, as we sort of wrap up the podcast, I think it does circle back around to that mind health that is the title of your podcast, because, you know, much of what happens in these diseases are biological facts, but on the other hand, how we approach them, how do we think about them? Again, what is the narrative that you choose? There's a sci-fi series that I think is on Amazon Prime, at least in the US. It's been out several years. I think it's based on a short stories that Ray Bradbury wrote, and it's called Electric Dreams or something like that. And one of the episodes involves an old woman who pays for a tourist trip on a spaceship out to she wants to go to a planet. At this time in the uncertain future, it's possible to just say, I'll pay a certain amount of money and just take a tourist trip to outer space. And she wants to visit a planet that the guys who are operating this ship know, in fact, this planet is a dead planet. Its atmosphere is toxic. There's nothing that can live on this planet. And I won't really take you through the whole story, but it's well worth watching. But in the end, what happens, you know, spoiler alert, is that she has imagined her life as she wants it, with the love of her life, who she imagines as one of the men on this ship, although it's not per se him, it's the person that she projects on his humanity, you know, his biological self or whatever. And ultimately, they go down to this planet and they're wearing these suits that theoretically protect them from the atmosphere. And he slowly but surely he enters her narrative. And in the final end, they take off their masks and they take off their suits. And instead of being this toxic dead planet, it's like being in Eden, because she has imagined it into being. And until we get to that point, the belief system that is so powerful, I mean, people don't realize that. But my wife Valerie and I were having a discussion yesterday about someone we're helping in my clinic, and these humps that we have to get over mentally to get into the right place for healing. You know, the patient said apparently to Valerie, they think that it's all in my head. And I want to go, it is. Like it is, because your brain is in your head, right? It is, right? But these, using terms like psychosomatic has such a negative connotation, or all in your head, but really it is, because when you start really truly believing through your heart and your brain that things are possible, that you can complete 140.6 miles in a day, my journey as an Ironman triathlete, right? Achieve the impossible, so to speak. Then many things are possible, right? Many things are possible. And so we have to empower folks. But to answer your question, you know, every human being that I work with is just that, a human being, and they have their belief system, they have their barriers, they have their open doors, another. We have to navigate that together. So much of functional medicine is really working through belief systems to ultimately get people to that transformative place of change
That's
and live it
beautiful.
every day.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And it's a huge challenge. And, the sort of mind-body connection is absolutely crucial. And then one final question before I let you go. I know you're really into technology for brain health and mental health. It's sort of a hobby of yours. What are the latest technologies, if any, have you found that you're particularly enthusiastic about in terms of brain health?
Well, I think in general that energy, we discount too often the role that energy can play on a therapeutic side. On the therapeutic side, we recognize that magnetic resonant imaging is very helpful diagnostically, that's MRI, but actually magnetic fields, such as is used in transcranial magnetic stimulation, electrical energy, such as transcranial direct current and alternating current stimulation, the role that sound, the role that light can play, all of these things. And in the electromagnetic field, we have pulsed electromagnetic field therapy as well, by the way. I think that is some of the most exciting stuff out there. And certainly we've used almost all of those modalities in one way or another in our clinic for many, many years. I think it's to discount the role of the therapeutic value of energy is really an oversight. And we can combine that with other more traditional modalities or lifestyle medicine and get even better outcomes. I think that from the point of view of just what can I do that's really available to me today, it's that I teach a lot of other providers, so they want those Monday morning hints, right? What can you do Monday morning after you hear me lecture over a weekend? And I would say to your listeners, check out sound therapy. And there are many forms of sound therapy, from the Tibetan bowls, but binaural rhythms or binaural beats and brain entrainment, because you can get a laser helmet for $2,000, or you can download some binaural rhythm recordings for less than $100, probably less than $25 for that matter. And there's really no evidence that sound is any less or more powerful than these expensive laser helmets. Sound is incredibly powerful and incredibly healing. So I would say to listeners and viewers, investigate the role of sound therapy, and I think you'd be amazed.
I think that's really beautiful. In fact, Stephen Porges, who is speaking at the IMMH 2024 as RU, is going to be giving a talk on his new polyvagal music, which is, he already has the Safe and Sound protocol, which works with sound for autism and ADHD and PTSD, but now he's launching polyvagal music to try and tone the vagal system by using sound. So that's very prescient and interesting. Well, Dr. Ken Sharlin, thank you so much. You were amazing. I highly recommend your book and also your Parkinson Summit, which is absolutely wonderful and very comprehensive. And I very much look forward to seeing you soon and hopefully at IMMH 2024, and keep up the wonderful work that you do.
Well, thank you, Kiki, and thank you for all the listeners and viewers who are taking part in this podcast as well. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Mind Health 360 show. I hope that we've helped you realize that mental health symptoms have root causes that can and need to be addressed in order to sustainably heal, and have given you some ideas about steps you, your loved ones, or clients may take to start their healing journey. Please share this interview with anyone you think may find it helpful, and don't forget to subscribe to keep up to date with our latest interviews on integrative mental health. If you want further information, please go to www.mindhealth360.com or find us on social media. This information is for educational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose or treat any disease or to replace medical advice. Please always consult your healthcare practitioner before discontinuing any medication or implementing any changes in your diet, lifestyle, or supplement program.